Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Embers of Childhood, Growing Up a Whitney, by Flora Miller Biddle. Narrated by Rosemary Benson. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Prologue. A sense of security, of well-being, of summer warmth pervades my memory. That robust reality makes a ghost of the present. The mirror brims with brightness. A bumblebee has entered the room and bumps against the ceiling. Everything is as it should be. Nothing will ever change. Nobody will ever die. Vladimir Nabokov. Speak Memory. Today, July 29th, is my mother's birthday. Once again, as often before, I wish I could speak with her. There's so much that I want to ask her, so much I'd like to tell her. First, I would tell her how much I loved her. I never told her in words. My mother's name was Flora Whitney Miller. Her second husband, my father, George McCullough Miller, was called Cully. My older half-brother was Whitney Tower. My half-sister is Pamela Tower, and my younger brother is Leverett Saltonstall Miller. I myself am Flora McCullough Miller. Many servants, both black and white, who tended to us over the years, were also part of our family. We lived in Aiken, South Carolina, in Joy Cottage. It was my first nest, and the one that means the most to me in my long life, a touchstone, origin and symbol of that part of me that is deep inside. In the summer, we went to the Adirondacks. We bathed in the cool lake, warming ourselves by a fire after catching fish for dinner or picking raspberries for a pie, lighting a kerosene lamp as darkness drew family and friends together. Our sadness each September as we left that paradise was linked to losing our freedom. We knew, even if we couldn't conceptualize it, that we would be returning to a more restricted life. For me, life elsewhere was never as pure as life in the Adirondacks. Good and evil never as unambiguous. Surely childhood should be a time for growth, for inventive play, for vivid sensations, for security, and for the certainties of good and bad. Just as surely, it fails to give us everything that we need, whether from the human failings of parents and caregivers, or the disasters of war, poverty, famine, and disease. How can I not feel grateful for the values of my own childhood? Separated from the hurly-burly of a great city, we lived in a gilded cage with all material comforts, surrounded by protective adults, unaware of hunger and the many forms of suffering that exist almost everywhere in our world. What was the effect of growing up in such a rarefied world? When did the good and evil I learned from the adults around me and from the Episcopal Church and its prayer book become real to me? Thanks to my upbringing, I developed a rosy view of life. It included a belief that I was lucky to have been born at that particular time, in that place, to that family. For many years I loved and idealized my childhood in Aiken. But when I married and had children, doubts began to surface. Had some of the prejudices I'd hardly noticed as a child, prejudices that I thought I'd rejected, stuck to me after all? As I envision my mother, other characters crowd into my thoughts. I wonder if, in grasping their elusive identities, perhaps I will better understand my own. As a child, I didn't know how valuable these people were to me. They were simply part of my life, and like most children, I took them for granted. At times, as I write, these people open their worlds to me. At others, they remain obscure, reluctantly yielding their secrets. Although some have died, they all remain with me. Part 1. History. Chapter 1. Ancestors. I don't remember my parents ever telling me that I would need a marketable skill. It would have been an outlandish idea. Among the many subjects we discussed at meals, tea or cocktails, politics, the war, hunting, fishing, riding, school, friends, travel, clothes, family, proper behavior, romances, movies, books, religion. Money was never a topic. Money was a mystery to me for years. My mother had grown up with absolutely no idea of the value of money. It must have seemed limitless to her, and in her parents' family it had been, less than 2 generations earlier. With a Whitney father and a Vanderbilt mother, my mother was born an American princess. What does this way of life mean to a family? To a community? We weren't the only ones. Most of the people I knew growing up were alike in class, religion, and income. My parents may have been at the top of the heap, but the philosophy was the same. Money grubbing and other disdainful references to a life of hard work made labor seem vulgar. Even talking about money was in bad taste, and we never did talk of it. Unaware of the source or extent of our uncommon comfort, we had no shame of it. Doing research in the 70s for B.H. Friedman's biography of my grandmother, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, I learned the sources of my family's wealth, and began to wonder how it had filtered away. There had once been so much money. What happened? Admittedly, there were a number of 20th century societal and economic factors. The graduated income tax, established through the 16th Amendment in 1913, made it difficult to maintain enormous fortunes through several generations. My great-great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had made the original money. As B.H. Friedman wrote, "Now, after these 3 generations, the energy which the Commodore had directed into creative productivity was being channeled largely into custodianship. To their Dutch Protestant tradition of industry and piety, there had already been added a sense of Puritan prudence and social service. Caretakers who do good don't usually increase large fortunes. Entrepreneurs do that. To backtrack, the first Vanderbilt of whom I know is a farmer, Jan Artsen Vanderbilt, of the manor of Bilt, near Zeist, Holland, who in the mid-17th century emigrated to Flatbush, New Amsterdam. Jan's grandson, Jacob, bought a large acreage in Stapleton, Staten Island, where farmland was less costly. Jacob's grandson, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and his wife Phoebe Hand, a strong, well-educated woman of English descent, raised their family there. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jr. was the 4th of their 9 children. At 11, this Cornelius was over 6 feet tall, with dark blue eyes, a hawk-like nose, strong mouth and chin, and a mop of wild blonde hair. This youth, already outstanding for his ambition and vitality, was to become the Commodore, named thanks to his large shipping interests. A bold, canny entrepreneur with limitless energy, he was especially attractive to women, as have been many of his descendants. The Commodore was respected by bankers and businessmen for his clear vision, toughness, and courage, and for sticking to the bargains he made. On the other hand, his speech and habits were crude. He swore like the docker he'd once been. He chewed tobacco and spat. In the elegant drawing rooms where Mrs. Astor and Ward McAllister were beginning to define and regulate a young American society, Cornelius was considered impossible. His rejection rankled, and in order to gain a place in society, he built, in 1846, a large townhouse at Washington Place in Manhattan. His loyal wife and cousin, Sophia, who'd been his hard-working partner as they began their rise, refused to leave their comfortable home in Staten Island, so he committed her to a private asylum for a few months until she agreed to move into their new house. Sophia died in 1868, and at 75, Cornelius married another cousin, Frank Armstrong Crawford, a 30-year-old Mobile, Alabama belle. In 1877, after 10 years of marriage and much hard work, he became ill. Ready to die, he calmly said farewell to his wife, children, and grandchildren as thousands gathered outside the house in a death watch. As his wife led the group in singing his favorite hymn, "Show Pity, Lord," he requested that Grand Central Depot, the icon of his success, not be draped in mourning black. Starting with virtually nothing but character and ability, the Commodore left at his death more than $100 million. Of this, $90 million went to his oldest son, William Henry. The remainder to his other 9 surviving children. It was the Commodore's intention to create a dynasty, and by keeping his fortune intact, he did just that. A superb caretaker, in 9 years, William doubled the fortune to $200 million, more than $2 billion in today's money. At his death in 1885, William's eldest son, Cornelius II, hard-working and intense, became head of the family. Besides taking over the business, he was much occupied with charity, becoming a trustee of major hospitals, universities, and churches. As head of the executive committee of the Metropolitan Museum, he donated many paintings to the museum, including Rosa Bonheur's popular The Horse Fair. Despite this cultural largesse, the Vanderbilts weren't accepted by longer-established wealth until March 26, 1883, when Cornelius's brother, William K. Vanderbilt, gave a costume ball for the opening of his new mansion, designed by William Morris Hunt, at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street in Manhattan. Miss Caroline Astor, daughter of the leader of the exclusive 400, planned a quadrille for her friends to give at the ball. When William's wife heard about it, she told a mutual friend she was sorry she couldn't invite Miss Astor to her ball, as her mother had never paid her a call. At last, Mrs. Astor saw fit to call on Mrs. Vanderbilt. The ball was described on page 1 of the New York Times as most extravagant. In photographs, Cornelius is dressed as Louis XIV in fawn-colored breeches trimmed with silver lace and a diamond-headed sword, while his wife, the former Alice Claypool Gwynn, holding an electric torch above her head as Electric Light, wears white satin trimmed with diamonds and a headdress of diamond-speckled feathers. Edison had made the first light bulb only 4 years earlier, in 1879, and newspapers had recently published impressive images of the Statue of Liberty, about to rise in New York Harbor. Their 8-year-old daughter, Gertrude, photographed perched in a tree, was a rose, in pink tulle with a satin overdress of green leaves. 4 years later, when the Social Register replaced Mrs. Astor's list, the Vanderbilts were included. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1899, each of his 5 children inherited about $7 million from a fortune already decreased by division, and an increasingly evident lack of entrepreneurial energy in the men of the family. In 1896, Cornelius's 21-year-old daughter, Gertrude, married the Vanderbilt's neighbor across 57th Street, Harry Payne Whitney. His fortune was smaller than hers, but he could trace his lineage back to Thurston the Fleming. Thurston had followed William the Conqueror into England and is mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086 as an extensive landholder in Hertfordshire and the Marches of Wales. In the 17th century, his family moved to Watertown, Massachusetts, where the men became successful leaders. Harry's father, William Collins Whitney, made the move into the bigger arena of national politics and business. He was over 6 feet tall, with large dark gray eyes, sharp, well-formed features, straight brown hair, and a soft mustache. At Yale, his friend William Graham Sumner later judged him easily the man of widest influence in our class, and perhaps in the college. After Yale and Harvard Law School, he practiced law in New York City, counting Cornelius Vanderbilt among his clients. In 1869, William married Flora Payne, sister of his friend and Yale classmate Oliver, and daughter of Henry B. Payne, one of the wealthiest and most powerful Democrats in Ohio, later to become U.S. Senator. Of the many Floras in my family, Flora Payne Whitney was the first. Unusually well-educated for a girl of that time, Flora had traveled in Europe, North Africa, and the Levant, pursuing her many interests, including science, archaeology, and languages. She had also attended an experimental seminary for women taught in Cambridge by Louis Agassiz. I have the 2 notebooks she kept, including high praise from Agassiz. When I leaf through the pages of fine script in which she describes the large variety of flora and fauna of which she made elegant, precise drawings, I realize how gifted she was. All her life, she wrote letters and diaries that reveal her grasp of current events, sense of humor, and emotional and intellectual depth. William Whitney soon became deeply involved in Democratic politics, fighting successfully against Tammany and the Tweed Ring as Corporation Counsel of New York City, eventually becoming Grover Cleveland's Secretary of the Navy. He was successful in modernizing the fleet and eliminating corrupt bidding and contracting practices at a time when the Navy represented the country's primary security and power. Harry Payne Whitney was Flora and William's oldest child. Their first, Leonore, died at birth. Never came a baby into the world more wanted, with more love ready to receive him than our boy, wrote Flora. And indeed, Harry received everything they could give him. At Yale, he earned a Phi Beta Kappa key, was on the board of the Yale Daily News, and a member of Hebul, Psi Epsilon, and Skull and Bones. He seemed destined for great things. Very much like his father, he differed from him in one important way. As B.H. Friedman and I determined, William C. Whitney had to work, had really to struggle in his early years for his money. Though Harry had all the advantages of 2 exceptionally distinguished parents and their great wealth, he had been better prepared for the leisurely sporting life of a gentleman and the custodianship of wealth than for a committed career from which he could receive satisfaction. Although he enrolled and took classes, Harry never completed Columbia Law School, never took the bar exam. He became instead a sports hero, often in newspaper headlines. He was captain of the Big Four, the Meadowbrook Club polo team that, in 1909, won the America Challenge Cup, held by England since 1886. My mother remembered Oakley Court, the castle her parents rented in England, and the excitement of the games, of receiving and being received by the King and Queen. Winning other big matches in America and England, her father and his teammates went on to triumph again in 1911 and 1913. Later, no longer able to play, he raced his powerful 75-foot schooner Vanity, nationally and internationally. And always he raced horses, often leading all owners in earnings. His regret was the first filly to win the Kentucky Derby. These activities led to lots of social life and lots of drinking. Late in his life, Harry invested in the Mammoth Oil Company, the subsidiary that held Harry F. Sinclair's lease on the U.S. Navy oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. The political scandal, while not implicating Harry, was a blow to both his pride and his investment portfolio. Concerned about his children's inheritance and wanting to recoup his money, he revived his long-unused but once estimable abilities and discovered and developed Flin Flon, an extremely productive mining property in northern Manitoba, Canada. His shares of Hudson Bay mining and smelting, the successor to Flin Flon, made a spectacular recovery after the worst effects of the Depression. In his will, made shortly before his death in 1930, the principle of primogeniture remained in force when he left his son, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, twice as much as he did to each of his two daughters. Harry's wife, Gertrude Vanderbilt, had different interests from her husband's. Although they loved each other and had 3 children together, they often lived separate lives. Gertrude became a sculptor who sought and often won large commissions. She made the Buffalo Bill in Cody, Wyoming, and an immense Columbus rising from the harbor in Palos, Spain. She had studios in Paris, Long Island, and at 19 McDougal Alley in New York's Greenwich Village, then center of the small American art world. Realizing that her friends in the village had no place to show their work in a New York obsessed with European art and culture, Gertrude bought the building adjoining hers at 8 West 8th Street to make the Whitney Studio, where she invited artists to have exhibitions. She bought work from each show and added more buildings at a time when American art was becoming more recognized and accepted. In 1931, Gertrude converted the original buildings to make inviting spaces with fine American furniture and rare textiles, and opened the Whitney Museum of American Art. With her husband's help, Gertrude provided the funds for the entire museum. By 1942, however, when she died, the museum was already exceeding her financial capacity. With the loss of entrepreneurial energy, with taxes, divorces, and many children, the family fortune had shrunk. My parents weren't good caretakers of their money. My talented father, George McCullough Miller, had had little money of his own to begin with, and wasn't motivated to earn more, as my mother's inheritance enabled them to live very comfortably. As partner in the architectural firm of Knoll and Miller, and a gifted amateur artist, his designs for buildings and his watercolors were beautiful, but not profitable. Their business affairs were looked after by his stockbroker brother and an office manager. Through generosity to their children, bad investments, and continued support of the Whitney Museum, an embodiment, really, of Flora's adored mother, Gertrude, the money was further diminished. At her death, in 1987, my mother's estate was tied up in land and houses. My siblings and I had to sell most of her properties and possessions to pay estate taxes, which is when we lost our share of the Adirondacks. Money is still an uncomfortable subject for me. My first husband, Michael Henry Irving, was kin to both the DuPonts of Delaware and Washington Irving. Like my father and my brother Lev, he'd gone to St. Paul's School. At Harvard, he'd been a member of the Porcellian Club with my brother Whitty, and then served in the Navy during World War II. After graduating from the Columbia Architectural School, Mike became a gifted architect who never lacked for work. He took pride in the money he earned and in the buildings he designed, including our own attractive modern home. We led a normal suburban life, different from my childhood, and, to me, preferable. Mike worked long hours. I, too, was busy with our 4 children, community activities, and my increasing involvement at the Whitney Museum. We had a full-time housekeeper until our last child was in school, then part-time house cleaners or babysitters. Over the years, I taught myself to cook and to care for the children, mostly with pleasure, and fully believed that it was a better way to live. My mother paid for our children's education and gave me unpredictable sums of cash from time to time. I don't have an extraordinary fortune, but I've never earned my living. This seems to me wrong, but it's too late to change. Financial inequality is an itch, and I've tried to scratch it in various ways, but I haven't repudiated the money I've inherited. My descendants will earn their own money. Chapter 2. Aiken. My great-grandfather, William C. Whitney, had followed his friend Thomas Hitchcock to Aiken, South Carolina, in the 1880s. These 2 men led Aiken's growth as a center for sports, with horses at the core. They bought over 8,000 acres of forest land, the Hitchcock Woods, for the enjoyment of their families and friends. William's first wife, my great-grandmother Flora Payne, died in 1893, and William, then only 55, married Edith S. Randolph. He enlarged the small country inn he'd bought in 1896 from a Charleston woman named Sarah Joy, and it became their home. Less than 2 years later, though, Edith broke her neck while riding under a low bridge, and died 15 months later. William was devastated. For the rest of his life, he immersed himself in horse racing and breeding, often in Aiken. For his stable of thoroughbreds, he constructed a mile-long racetrack with training stables where he wintered his racehorses and trotters. Both this track and the first polo site, Whitney Field, have been in use ever since. No cars were allowed, only horses. The 2 partners saw to it that the soft clay roads of Aiken stayed unpaved, as some still do today. After its introduction to the United States in 1876, polo became a bit like football is today, popular with well-known stars. Through the 1930s, as many as 40,000 people came from New York to watch the big matches at the Meadowbrook Club in Long Island. As Nelson W. Aldrich says in his book, Old Money, there is no sport that more graphically illustrates the means and objectives of old money's ordeals. The man on horseback is a primal image of command and self-command, grace and power united. Polo is the most difficult game on earth, requiring the horsemanship of a Genghis Khan, the anticipatory sense of a hockey player, and the hand-eye coordination of a pool shark. To play it well, therefore, one has to have always, passed perfectly, played it. The entrepreneur cannot learn it without looking ridiculous. At one time, there were 16 polo fields in Aiken. William C. Whitney's son, my grandfather Harry Payne Whitney, became a 10-goal player, the very top, and kept up the tradition of polo in Aiken, attracting first-rate teams with their stables of horses for major tournaments and their attendant social events. Court tennis is the world's oldest racket game, played by European royalty and clergy from at least the 13th century. In 1902, in Aiken, William built one of only 7 courts in the United States for this challenging and complex game in which the ball can be played off both walls.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?